Dad, you can't seriously expect me to give up my career to be your nursemaid. That's what nursing homes are for." Those words came from my eldest daughter Patricia as she sat in my living room with her 3 siblings, all of them arguing about anything except actually taking care of their dying father. I'm William Bill Thompson, 76 years old, and after raising 4 successful children who are now debating who can avoid responsibility for my care, I realized I had one final lesson to teach them about family, duty, and what it really means to love someone. Let me tell you how I discovered that my children would fight harder to avoid helping me than they ever fought to achieve their own success, and how I used that revelation to change all of our lives forever. The conversation that shattered my understanding of my family happened 3 weeks after my diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors said 6 to 12 months if I was lucky, maybe less if the treatment didn't work. I'd spent those 3 weeks absorbing the news, getting my affairs in order, and preparing to tell my children that I would need their help during whatever time I had left. I called a family meeting, thinking we'd discuss care options, treatment, schedules, and how to spend my remaining months together. Instead, I got a masterclass in how successful adults can be remarkably creative when it comes to avoiding inconvenient responsibilities. "Dad, this is terrible news," said my second daughter, Janet, a high-powered attorney who bills $500 an hour. "But we need to be practical about care options. There are excellent facilities that specialize in this kind of situation." "Facilities?" I asked. "Janet, I'm talking about spending my last months with my family, not being warehoused with strangers." My youngest son, Robert, a corporate executive who travels constantly for work, jumped in immediately. "Dad, none of us are qualified to provide the kind of medical care you're going to need. Professional caregivers are really the safest option." Patricia nodded vigorously. "Robert's right. I mean, I'd love to help, but I have 3 teenagers at home, and a job that requires 60-hour weeks. I literally don't have the bandwidth to take on another full-time responsibility." My eldest son, Michael, who'd inherited my small construction business and turned it into a regional operation, had a different excuse. "Dad, my house isn't set up for someone with mobility issues. No wheelchair ramps, bathrooms on the 2nd floor, none of the accessibility features you'd need." What struck me wasn't just that they were all looking for ways to avoid caring for me, but how quickly they'd shifted from grief about my diagnosis to problem-solving about disposal of the inconvenience I'd become. "Kids, I'm not asking anyone to quit their jobs or rebuild their houses. I'm asking for help during the hardest time of my life." That's when the real argument began. Not about who would help me, but about who had the best excuse for not helping me. Patricia pointed out that she was the only one with teenagers still at home, making her care responsibilities too complex to add an elderly parent. Janet argued that her legal practice was at a critical juncture and she couldn't afford to take time off. Robert insisted that his travel schedule made him unreliable for consistent care. Michael claimed that his business required his constant attention and that caring for me would jeopardize the livelihoods of his employees. "Look, Dad," Janet said in her lawyer voice, "we've all worked hard to build our careers and our lives. You raised us to be independent and successful. You can't expect us to sacrifice everything we've built just because you're sick." "I'm not asking you to sacrifice everything. I'm asking you to help me die with dignity instead of dying alone." "You won't be alone, Dad," Robert said. "You'll be in a facility with professional staff and other residents. You might even enjoy the social interaction." Social interaction, as if dying of cancer was a lifestyle choice that might benefit from a community setting. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with each of my children explaining in great detail why they were uniquely unsuited to provide care, while simultaneously suggesting that one of their siblings was better positioned to take responsibility. Patricia thought Janet, being single and childless, had more flexibility. Janet thought Michael, having inherited the family business, owed me more consideration. Michael thought Robert, being the youngest, should step up since he'd received the most financial support during college. Robert thought Patricia, as the eldest, should take the lead in family decisions. It was like watching four attorneys argue a case where they were all trying to lose. Dad, the reality is that none of us can provide the level of care you're going to need. Michael finally said, "We're not doctors or nurses. We're just your kids, and we have our own families and responsibilities to think about. Just your kids." As if being my children was some minor inconvenience, rather than the most important relationship in their lives. "Let me ask you something," I said quietly. "When you were children and you needed something, school clothes, help with homework, rides to activities, money for college, did I ever tell you that I was just your father and you'd have to find professional help?" The silence that followed was deafening. "That's different, Dad," Patricia said, finally. "That was your job as a parent. We didn't choose to be born. And I didn't choose to get cancer, sweetheart. But here we are." The meeting ended with a promise that they'd research options and explore alternatives and get back to me with a plan. What they meant was that they'd find the nicest way possible to put me somewhere I'd be someone else's responsibility. Over the following weeks, they did indeed research options. Janet found 3 upscale care facilities within 50 miles. Patricia researched home health services that could provide round-the-clock care. Robert looked into medical insurance coverage for various treatment options. Michael got estimates for retrofitting my house with accessibility features, but none of them researched what it would actually mean to care for me themselves. None of them considered rearranging their schedules, adjusting their priorities, or making the sacrifices that caring for a dying parent would require. They were approaching my care the same way they'd approach any other business problem: find the most efficient solution that minimized disruption to their existing lives. But I'd been thinking too, and I'd come to a conclusion that would surprise all of them. If my children were so determined to avoid caring for me that they'd spend more energy arguing about who couldn't do it than considering how they might do it, then I needed to create a situation that would force them to confront the truth about what kind of people they'd become. I called my attorney, Harold Weiss, who'd handled my legal affairs for 20 years. "Harold, I need to make some changes to my will, and I need to set up a very specific situation that will test my children in a way they're not expecting." "Bill, what did you have in mind?" "I want to create a scenario where my children have to compete for their inheritance. But the competition will reveal who among them is actually willing to put family ahead of convenience." What I developed with Harold's help was a plan that would force my children to choose between their stated priorities and their financial interests, while giving them one final opportunity to discover what really mattered. The new will divided my estate, which included my house, a substantial savings account, and ownership shares in Michael's construction business, among my 4 children, but with conditions that would only be revealed after my death. The will specified that whoever provided my primary care during my illness would receive 60% of the estate, while the others would split the remaining 40%. But there was a twist that my children wouldn't discover until it was too late to game. The system, the primary care requirement, wasn't just about physical presence or financial contribution. It was about emotional availability, genuine attention, and treating me like a person rather than a problem to be managed. Harold would be monitoring my care through weekly visits, documenting who spent meaningful time with me, who advocated for my preferences about treatment and living arrangements, and who treated me with dignity and respect rather than just efficiency and obligation. Bill, this is quite elaborate. Are you sure you want to put your children through this kind of test? Harold, my children are putting me through the test of whether they love me enough to inconvenience themselves for my sake. I'm just making sure there are consequences for their choices. But I didn't tell my children about the will changes. Instead, I implemented a different strategy that would reveal their true characters while giving them every opportunity to do the right thing. I told them I'd decided to stay in my own home and hire professional caregivers, funded by selling some investments. This removed their excuse that caring for me would be financially burdensome, while creating opportunities for them to be involved in my care without sacrificing their careers. Dad, that sounds like a reasonable compromise, Janet said when I announced my decision. You'll have professional help, but you'll still be in your own environment. I'm glad you approve. Of course, I'll still need family support, help with medical appointments, companionship during treatments, assistance with decisions about my care. But the day-to-day responsibilities will be handled by professionals. This was their chance to step up without major sacrifice. All I was asking for was emotional support, regular visits, and inclusion in my final months of life. Their response was revealing. Patricia visited once in the first month, staying for about 30 minutes to check on my situation. She spent most of the visit asking the caregiver about my condition rather than talking to me directly. Janet called weekly but always seemed rushed, asking perfunctory questions about my health before moving on to updates about her work. When I tried to discuss my fears about dying or my sadness about our family dynamics, she'd redirect the conversation to practical matters. Robert visited twice in 6 weeks, both times bringing his laptop so he could work while spending time with me. He seemed to view his visits as multitasking opportunities rather than occasions for meaningful connection. Michael stopped by most frequently, but his visits felt like business inspections rather than family time. He'd check that the caregivers were doing their jobs, that the house was being maintained properly, and that I wasn't being taken advantage of financially. None of them asked about my emotional state, my fears about dying, or how they could make my remaining time more meaningful. None of them advocated for my preferences when medical decisions arose. None of them treated me like their father who was dying, rather than a responsibility they were managing efficiently. Meanwhile, Harold was documenting everything, noting the frequency and quality of each child's involvement, their responsiveness to my needs, and their willingness to prioritize my well-being over their convenience. The most telling incident happened when I had to be hospitalized for a week due to complications from my treatment. I'd specifically asked that someone from the family be present when the doctors discussed my prognosis and remaining treatment options. Patricia couldn't make it because of a parent-teacher conference. Janet was in court and couldn't reschedule. Robert was traveling for business. Michael showed up but spent most of the doctor's meeting taking calls about a construction project. I ended up making crucial decisions about my end-of-life care with only Harold present, while my 4 successful children were too busy with their own priorities to participate in the conversation that would determine how I spent my final months. Mr. Thompson, my oncologist, said during that meeting, "It's unusual for patients to make these decisions without family input. Are you sure you don't want to wait until your children can be present?" "Doctor, my children have made it clear that managing their own lives takes priority over participating in the end of mine. I'd rather make these decisions with people who are actually here. Harold documented that conversation, along with my children's explanations for their absence and their responses when they learned about the decisions I'd made without them. "Dad, you should have insisted we be there," Patricia said when she found out. "These are important decisions." "I did insist, sweetheart. You chose parent-teacher conferences over your father's end-of-life planning. That's not fair. You know I would have been there if I could have rescheduled." "Could you have rescheduled?" "Well, it would have been difficult. Patricia, I'm dying. Difficult shouldn't be the deciding factor." Similar conversations happened with each of my children, and Harold documented their willingness to prioritize convenience over presence, efficiency over emotional connection, management over meaningful involvement. But the plan had a second phase that my children didn't see coming. 3 months after my diagnosis, I called another family meeting. This time, I had a different kind of announcement. "Kids, I need to tell you something important. Harold has been documenting your involvement in my care for the past few months." "What do you mean, documenting?" Janet asked, immediately shifting into lawyer mode. "I mean keeping records of who visits, who helps with medical decisions, who treats me like a person rather than a problem to be managed." Michael looked confused. "Dad, why would Harold be keeping records?" "Because I've changed. My will, my estate, will be distributed based on who actually provides care and support during my illness, not just who shows up to claim their inheritance after I die." The room went completely silent. "Dad, what are you saying?" Robert asked. "I'm saying that whoever demonstrates genuine care, emotional support, and personal sacrifice during my illness will inherit the majority of my estate. Whoever treats me like an inconvenience to be managed will inherit accordingly." Patricia was the first to explode. "Dad, that's not fair. You never told us that our inheritance depended on some kind of caregiving competition." "I didn't tell you, because I wanted to see who would care for me out of love, rather than financial incentive. Now I know." Janet, predictably, wanted to see the documentation. "Dad, what criteria is Harold using? How is care being measured?" "This sounds like a completely subjective evaluation that could be challenged legally." "Feel free to challenge it. Janet, Harold has detailed records of every interaction, every missed appointment, every time you chose your convenience over my needs. I'm confident the documentation will speak for itself." Michael tried a different approach. "Dad, this isn't how families should work. You're turning love into a transaction." "No, Michael, you turned love into a transaction when you started calculating the cost of caring for me, rather than figuring out how to be present for my death. I'm just making sure there are consequences for those calculations." What happened next was both predictable and heartbreaking. Instead of using this revelation as motivation to change their behavior and genuinely engage with my care, my children began strategizing about how to game the system. Patricia started visiting more frequently, but her visits felt performative rather than genuine. She'd stay for exactly 1 hour, ask scripted questions about my health, and make sure Harold was aware of her presence. Janet began scheduling regular calls and documenting them, creating a paper trail of her involvement while continuing to avoid any conversations about my emotional state or fears about dying. Robert rearranged his travel schedule to be present for medical appointments, but he spent those appointments checking his phone and seemed more concerned with being seen as involved than actually engaging with my care decisions. Michael started bringing his wife and children for weekly dinners, turning my care into a family obligation that everyone resented rather than an opportunity for meaningful connection. watching my children try to manipulate their way into a larger inheritance while continuing to avoid genuine, emotional engagement was more painful than the cancer itself. But Harold was documenting all of it: the calculated visits, the performed concern, the strategic involvement that prioritized appearance over authenticity. "Bill," Harold said during one of his monitoring visits, "your children are responding exactly as you predicted. They're more concerned with gaming your system than actually caring for you." "I know, Harold, but I needed them to reveal who they really are, both to me and to themselves." "What's the next phase of your plan?" "The next phase is teaching them that some things can't be gamed, manipulated, or managed efficiently. Some things require genuine sacrifice and authentic presence." 6 months after my diagnosis, I called a final family meeting. By this point, my health had deteriorated significantly, and everyone knew I didn't have much time left. "Kids, I have something to tell you that's going to shock you." They all leaned forward, probably expecting another twist to my inheritance plan. "The will I described doesn't exist." Silence. "What do you mean it doesn't exist?" Janet asked. "I mean there is no competition for inheritance based on caregiving. My estate is divided equally among the 4 of you, exactly as it was before my diagnosis." "Dad, I don't understand," Robert said. "The will change was a fiction. Harold's documentation was real, but it wasn't for legal purposes. It was to show you exactly who you've become as people." I pulled out a folder containing Harold's detailed records: every missed visit, every perfunctory call, every time they'd chosen convenience over presence, and most importantly, every time they'd treated my dying as a problem to be managed rather than a relationship to be treasured. "For 6 months, you've known that I'm dying, and you've treated my need for care as an inconvenience to be minimized rather than an opportunity to show love. When you thought your inheritance depended on caring for me, you started visiting more often, but you couldn't manage to make those visits genuine or meaningful." Patricia started crying. "Dad, we love you. We just didn't know how to handle this situation." "Sweetheart, you didn't know how to handle caring for your dying father, because you've spent so much energy building lives that don't have room for inconvenient family obligations." "That's not true," Michael protested. "We all have responsibilities, families of our own, careers that support those families. Michael, when you were building your business, who helped you with startup costs, co-signed loans, and worked weekends without pay to help you succeed? You did, Dad. When Patricia's husband left her with 3 small children, who provided childcare, financial support, and emotional encouragement until she got back on her feet. You did, Patricia whispered. When Janet was studying for the bar exam, who paid her rent, bought her groceries, and took care of every practical detail so she could focus on her career. You did. When Robert was unemployed for 8 months after college, who supported him financially and emotionally until he found his footing. You did. I made those sacrifices because you were my children and I loved you more than my own convenience. But when I needed you to inconvenience yourselves for my sake, you all discovered that your careers, schedules, and comfort were more important than my final months of life." The silence that followed was profound. "Dad," Robert said quietly, "we didn't realize, you didn't realize that caring for a dying parent might require actual sacrifice. You didn't realize that love sometimes means putting someone else's needs ahead of your own schedule." Harold spoke up for the first time during the meeting. "If I may, Bill has asked me to share some specific examples from my documentation." He opened his folder and began reading. Patricia visits averaged 47 minutes over 6 months, with most conversations focused on logistics rather than emotional support. When asked about her father's fears regarding death, Patricia redirected conversations to practical matters 73% of the time. Janet's phone calls averaged 12 minutes, with 8 of those minutes typically spent on Janet's own life updates. When Bill expressed sadness about family dynamics during his illness, Janet changed the subject to legal or medical logistics 89% of the time. Robert attended 60% of scheduled medical appointments but spent an average of 40% of those appointments on work-related phone calls or emails. When asked by medical staff about his father's preferences for care, Robert deferred to professional recommendations rather than advocating for his father's stated wishes. Michael visited most frequently but consistently treated care evaluation as business efficiency rather than emotional support. When Bill expressed desire for family dinners or activities, Michael focused on logistics and delegation rather than personal engagement 78% of the time. Listening to Harold's clinical documentation of my children's emotional absence was devastating. But it was also clarifying. Kids, I created this elaborate test because I needed you to see what I was seeing, that you'd all become so successful at managing your own lives that you'd lost the ability to simply be present for someone else's life, especially when that presence required sacrifice. Dad, what can we do to fix this? Janet asked, and for the first time in months, her question sounded genuine rather than strategic. I don't know if it can be fixed, honey. I have maybe 2 months left, and I've spent the last 6 months feeling more alone than I've ever felt in my life, despite being surrounded by 4 children who claim to love me. What happened next surprised me more than anything else in this entire experience. Patricia stood up and walked to my chair, knelt down, and took my hands in hers. Dad, I'm so sorry. I've been treating your dying like a project to be managed, rather than time to be treasured. I don't know how to fix the last 6 months, but I want to do better with whatever time we have left. What would that look like, sweetheart? It would look like me actually being here, not just visiting. It would look like me asking about your fears and your memories instead of just your symptoms. It would look like me treating you like my father, who's dying rather than a responsibility I'm fulfilling. Janet was next. Dad, I've been hiding behind professional competence because I don't know how to handle losing you. I've been treating your care like a legal case instead of a relationship. I want to learn how to just be your daughter during this time. Robert's response was the most honest. Dad, I've been avoiding spending real time with you because watching you die is scary and sad, and I don't know how to handle those feelings. But avoiding them isn't working, and it's making your dying even lonelier than it has to be. Michael's admission was the most painful. Dad, I've been managing your care. Because managing feels like helping, and helping feels like loving. But I realize that what you need isn't management, it's connection. And I don't know how to connect with someone who's dying because it makes me feel helpless. For the first time since my diagnosis, my children were talking to me about my dying rather than around it, acknowledging their own discomfort rather than hiding behind efficiency and logistics. Kids, learning how to be present for someone who's dying isn't something they teach in business school or law school or any of the places where you learned to be successful. But it's one of the most important skills you can develop as human beings. How do we learn it, Dad? Patricia asked. You learn it by showing up anyway, even when it's uncomfortable. You learn it by asking me about my fears instead of avoiding them. You learn it by sharing your own sadness about losing me instead of pretending this is just a medical situation to be managed. Will you teach us? Janet asked. Will you help us learn how to be better at this? That question, coming from my brilliant, attorney daughter who'd spent months avoiding emotional engagement, broke something open in my chest. "Of course, I'll teach you, sweetheart. That's what fathers do." The final 2 months of my life were completely different from the first 6 months after my diagnosis. Instead of managing my care, my children began participating in my dying. Instead of visiting me, they began spending time with me. Instead of asking about my condition, they began asking about my thoughts, my memories, my hopes for them after I was gone. Patricia started coming by every evening after work, not to check on my care, but to share dinner and conversation. She told me about her teenager's challenges, asked for advice about parenting decisions, and shared memories of her own childhood that she'd never mentioned before. Janet reduced her caseload so she could be present for medical appointments. But instead of managing the logistics, she advocated for my preferences and helped me make decisions that honored my values, rather than just extending my life. Robert rearranged his travel schedule so he could be home more consistently, and he used that time to ask me about my life, my experiences, my thoughts about what mattered most. He brought his children to visit regularly, helping them understand that watching someone die with dignity is part of loving them completely. Michael transformed his business visits into family time, bringing his wife and children for dinners, where we shared stories, played games, and created new memories. Even as we acknowledged that our time together was limited. But the most important change was that we all learned to talk honestly about my dying. Instead of pretending it wasn't happening or managing it like a business problem, we acknowledged the sadness, the fear, the love, and the gratitude that came with knowing our time together was ending. "Dad," Patricia said one evening as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, "I'm so grateful that you forced us to see how badly we were handling this. I would have regretted forever that I spent your final months managing your care instead of loving you through your dying. Sweetheart, you were managing my care because you didn't know how to love me through dying. Now you know. What's the difference? Managing my care is about making sure I'm comfortable and my needs are met. Loving me through dying is about making sure I feel valued and connected and remembered. Both are important, but one is about my body and the other is about my soul." When I died 3 weeks later, I was surrounded by 4 children who had learned the difference between caring for someone and caring about someone, between managing a problem and being present for a person, between fulfilling an obligation and expressing love. The will I actually left divided my estate equally among my children. But it included letters explaining why I'd created the elaborate test, and what I'd learned about each of them through the process. "Patricia," I wrote, "you discovered that love sometimes requires showing up even when it's inconvenient, and that being present is more valuable than being efficient. Janet, you learned that competence isn't the same as caring, and that your professional skills can't substitute for emotional availability. Robert, you found out that avoiding difficult emotions doesn't make them go away, and that facing sadness together is better than managing it alone. Michael, you realized that helping someone and controlling their situation aren't the same thing, and that sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is simply witness someone else's experience without trying to fix it." The letters also included my gratitude for their willingness to learn, to change, and to choose relationship over convenience during my final months. At my funeral, each of my children spoke about what they'd learned from my dying, and how that experience had changed not just their relationship with me, but their understanding of what it means to love someone completely. My father taught me that caring for someone who's dying isn't about managing their condition, Patricia said. It's about honoring their life, and making sure they know they matter until the very end. He showed me that the skills that make you successful in your career don't necessarily make you successful as a human being, Janet added. Learning to be present for someone else's pain is a completely different skill than solving problems or managing outcomes. Dad forced us to choose between our comfort and his well-being, Robert continued, and he taught us that love isn't just a feeling. It's a series of choices to prioritize someone else's needs, even when it's difficult. Most importantly, Michael concluded, he showed us that how you treat someone who's dying reveals who you really are as a person. And he gave us the chance to become better people than we were when his illness began. The test I created for my children wasn't really about inheritance or caregiving competition. It was about forcing them to confront the kind of people they'd become in their pursuit of success, and giving them an opportunity to choose family over convenience, presence over efficiency, love over management. They all passed the test, not because they gamed the system, but because they learned that some things are more important than systems, strategies, and personal convenience. And they learned that the most important inheritance I could leave them wasn't money or property, but the knowledge that loving someone completely sometimes requires sacrificing for them completely, especially when they're most vulnerable and in need. How do you think adult children should balance their own responsibilities with caring for aging parents? Have you ever struggled with the challenge of being present for someone who's dying? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give someone is learning to choose relationship over convenience, even when it's difficult. If this story made you think about family obligations and what it really means to love someone, please subscribe for more stories about family dynamics, end-of-life care, and the choices that define who we really are. From what city are you watching today?